Welcome to the 9th episode of our second season of the PigX podcast. As always, I'm your host, Delaney Howell. On this installment of the show, we're talking about both the sow and the piglet. And as you'll later hear, we discuss what we can do as caretakers in order to ensure the ultimate care for our sows in order to decrease both piglet and sow mortality. Survivability and the sow go hand in hand, so let's learn more about that and how it impacts the operation with Dr. Ron Ketchem of 30 and Up Consulting, who I caught up with to have a great conversation. Serving in the industry, we won't give away the exact length of time you've been in there, but you've been in the industry for quite a while. You are a veteran in the swine industry. Talk to us about your background to start out.
My background, I grew up on a domestic farm in Missouri. We had cattle, sheep, we had all the domestic things. Learned early on at agriculture, something I liked. Went to the University of Missouri to school and was on an honors program there. So I got to do my basic studies. So I have a BS in animal science. But then I was mentored by the head of reproduction. I was one of his students and got involved with the research they were doing with some of the graduate students, even learned how to do basic egg recoveries and stuff. Then I did some master's studies at my last year there. That I didn't have a master's, but I did master's studies toward that in reproductive physiology and animal breeding. So I had those kinds of expertise. I learned how to do AI. I AI'd my first sow in 1969. That's starting to date me. But AI was something they were using in the research farm and something I picked up on. So my first job out of school was working with a genetic company developing their AI breeding program, which started out with them in 1973. And their reason there was a genetics company that wanted to transfer genes around, but they did not want to take live animals between their multiplication system. So we would go in, we had a central boar stud, collect the boars, go out, breed them that day, a few sows in that farm, and so then to raise the next generation replacement animals for that farm. And so at that time, it was collect the boar one day, extend the semen because we had no good extenders, collect him the next day, hope he would collect the next day and go back and breed him a second time. So it was pretty crude, but we got the job done and we did it by, not having to bring live animals into populations. So health was a key area way back then in the 70s.
Yeah, and it's crazy to see how much health has evolved to today because most recently you served as a consultant or you owned swine management services before that was sold to Meta Farms.
Yeah, Swine Management Services was a management company that Purina Mills had started in 1994. And at that time, these large sow farms were going in. Investors would put so much money in, instead of farrowing sows at home, they would take back pigs from these co-op units. So that was the main growth of them was going on. So this particular group would then help you find a piece of land. They had drawings that they would do to help you build a building. They would do off-site breeding projects, populate the barn. They'd hire and fire the management and do your financials and all your record keeping. So that's where I went to work with. They started in 94. I joined the group in 2000. And I was charged of all the training and genetic evaluation that was being done. Then in 2001, Land O'Lakes comes in and they buy out Purina Mills. They did not want the Swine Management Services division of Purina Mills. So part of it was spun off to another group, and there was a few of us left, and Mark Ricks and I decided to buy it. So we took ownership of that company in August of 2002. And we changed the floor plan of it. At that time, they were hiring and firing people. We went back to strictly doing record keeping, doing financials, and then we kind of hit upon doing farm analysis, which we would take the data from a records from a program, put it into a set of charts and stuff we created, and write them back a note saying, here's some things that are good, here's some things that are bad, here's some things we'd like to see you try. So that grew over the years to at one time we were doing about 200 farms, about 450,000 sows, U.S., Canada, and a little bit in Australia. So people wanted us to tell them what the data said. We made suggestions, and then those farms took back to their managers and then made the changes. So that was a big part of what SMS was doing.
So let's talk about that data, because obviously with that role, you were collecting a lot of data. You were able to look at a lot of different trends that were happening across the industry. Talk to us a little bit about the last 16 years when you look at mated and weaning data.
Okay, we got then approached by genetic company to say, can you take these 10 farms and can you compare them somehow? And so that's where the benchmarking started. So then we started going to the genetic companies and saying, you give us some of your producers with their records and we'll compare them against a data set. So it started in 2005. I think we had 125,000 sows in the first round that we did. The key component we figured out is there was different record programs out there that had different calculations. And so the National Pork Board in the late 90s actually came up with a set of calculation that they would like to suggest for like pigs weaned per mated female per year. So we incorporated those calculations. We would pull raw data in from the different record programs and then standardize the data so you could compare across the different record programs. And at one time in SMS, we had 26 different record programs that we pulled data from to put into the benchmark program. So by being able to do that, we were then could take a genetic company that had maybe 100 producers that had 10 different record programs and standardize the data and give it back to them. An individual report went to the farm, a composite report went to the genetic company, and they could see how they were doing, compared within their own company and also compared to a larger data set. So it's grown from about 125,000 to we're about 1.8 million sows that are in it now. And as I mentioned earlier, there's about 30,000 sows in there that are from Australia, which represents about 10% of the production of Australia. And then there's about 350,000 sows in there, which is about 30% of the sows in Canada that are in that data set. And so it's been interesting to gather all this data, and that would be across all genetic lines, all ages of facilities, all management levels, all sizes of farms, and then be able to sort that stuff out into different components like size of farm or things like that, and then be able to look at data. So we had this big research set of data, commercial data, that let us dive into it and write papers and do research parts and look at data.
So talk to me a little bit about some of the research that you did specifically around female death loss.
When we tracked it, we try to break the data out. We used to break it out in increments of top 10% and the next 20%, 20%, and the bottom 30%. So a few years ago, we decided we'll just go the top 10%, we'll go with the average of all. So we actually saw when we started the data set that actually overall death loss starting back in 2005 dropped for about 3 or 4 years. And our thought process is that's when the National Pork Board introduced PQA, Pork Quality Assurance, where you were training people on farms, certifying them how to use and do vaccinations and things like that. We saw it drop. And then we saw it kind of level off, and then the all numbers started out about 6-7 years ago. It started to go up about 0.5% a year, and really not knowing exactly why, but we saw that as a trend line. And we saw the top 10% farms, they basically drove it down to less than 6% there for several years. Even the last about 5 years, they've seen their numbers go up to about, I think, 8.5% now. Last year was the average of that top 10% farm. So that's why this has kind of been alarming to a lot of people in the industry is why is it happening and what do we got to do to fix it?
And I think that's really kind of the initiative of the Livability Project and grant is to try and identify the reason why behind some of those factors.
Yeah, and there have been some side studies done. National Pork Board did the prolapse study back in 2018, tried to look at that area. And again, a lot of things were reviewed. Some conclusions came out of it, but some things came out of it that weren't causing it, but we never got to the root cause of what really causes that to happen. Same thing here we are now. And just like I shared with the group, when we narrow down the death loss and look at a time period, that 30% is occurring in a 9-day period, a couple days before farrowing through farrowing. So why is that? What do we got to change to address that issue? We also talked about the shifting of the last few years into the younger parities, where now 47%, we did this I think a year ago, of the death loss is P0s, 1s, and 2s. And I think it's an underestimated number because a lot of farms don't add their gilts in until they breed them. So what is happening in that gilt pool as far as death loss is probably not recorded that could probably be a part of that number. It may be as high as 50% of the gilts they started with of the 0s, 1s, and 2s are being culled by that second parity.
It feels like a lot of questions right now.
I think it's a lot of questions, and people like me are pretty good about asking questions. what the data tells us, and we just say, hey, what's going on? What's causing that to happen?
So you also talked about when you look at the economics behind mortality and some of the trends you've seen, you also talked about the value of a dead sow and how you went about calculating that, because that obviously is a big impact on a producer's bottom line. How did you walk through that, and what is the value?
Well, I'm not an economist by design. I think something that the economists would create will be a lot more detailed than what I did. So I just kind of called it farmer math. But we looked at, you bought a gilt, you developed her. It's $320 to $50 you've invested here, and that's gone. We looked at the feed cost. Usually these animals that die are dying before farrowing gestation. They only have a litter of pigs in them. So we say we've got the feed for that litter of pigs we got to consider. There's some vaccinations. And then I put in there that loss of income of that dead litter. There was an animal there that could have sold me, and I use example of 11 pigs at $35. That was income that I did not receive, and I put that in cost in. So that's another cost I put in. Now, a lot of people don't think about that. And then I looked at the loss of the not able to sell that cull animal because she died. And, there's 450 pounds I used as weight. I used 35 cents a hundred. Well, today that's probably about double that. We lost that income to the farm. So I came up with about $1,000 as the cost of a dead sow that you take out of there. And then again, I haven't put in there the cost of the extra labor, the disposal, extra replacement costs increase to getting more gilts into the farm. There's lots of things that probably need to be considered in a more modern model. That cost could be $1,500, real simply, from a dead animal. And that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. It certainly is. You kind of broke it up today into two different segments. So we were talking about sows. You also talked a little bit about piglet mortality. But before we get to that, I thought this was hilarious that you shared with the group today, talking about pedicures for pigs. What? We now need to give pedicures to our pigs.
Yeah. Several years ago, I attended a conference put on by ZenPro, I think in Minneapolis. And one of their research people I knew pretty well, Dr. Wilson. And we got to talking about that. And he actually had at that conference, they brought in some feet from some animals, and they showed how they were starting to do trimmings, and showing at that time they didn't have the walking like was shown from the PAC rep. But they were showing us that all this stuff is growing on, the extra growth of the toes, the uneven growth, the growth of the dew claws. And I kind of took that to heart, saying, I got lots of farms. When I look down the pens or the crates we got treated animals in, there's a lot of them, we're doing something with their feet, a busted toe, a pulled off dew claw. I said, that's something we got to look at. So I actually worked with them, and we looked at trimming feet. Now, there's a lift station. I have one group I work with that has a lift station at each farm. They can lift the sow up. They take a grinder. They have somebody that's pretty much his full-time job. So I said, that's a $10,000 investment. I said, we can probably do something simpler. So I went to the store, and I got a set of clippers. I took to a farm, and we went about trimming toes, and we found that a few toes needed to be trimmed, but it was mainly the dew claws. And there's actually some just simple rules of thumb on trimming the toes and trimming the dew claws is trimming the dew claw back to where the coronary band is, which is where the hair and the hoof separate. Just clipping that dew claw off at that level. It gets it above the ground. It's not going to get stuck like it would if it overgrows. And same thing with the toes. We trim the toes back to basically it's about 50 millimeters or 3 fingers from where the hair is on that. We can trim that toe back that far to try to even it up. So ours looks kind of crude, but again, it gets the sow back where she's got her weight distribution even again. And that's what's causing her when she shifts those feet, it wears the pads. The pads get worn, she gets a crack in her hoof, and she gets infection, then we got a big problem. And same thing with the dew claws. If that dew claw is pulled off or it's busted, infection takes place real quick, and we really can't a lot of times treat them out of it. We end up getting a large foot, and we end up having to euthanize the sows. So I've got farms now, when they walk the sows up from gestation to the farrowing houses, somebody makes a note on her left back dew claw seems to be a little bit long. Somebody will be within the next day or two will be in there trimming off that dew claw. And I've got a sow farm, and I put this in pretty religiously a couple of years ago. And we dropped our sow mortality 3% just by trimming those feet. So it's something that has economic value, and it just has to be part of the process now of working in a sow barn.
And so you mentioned there dropped sow mortality by 3%. You talked a little bit today also about the standardization of female death loss reasons. Would you classify that as a locomotion issue?
As a locomotion issue, yeah. Yeah, so we wanted to get it into 6 buckets instead of 70 or 80, which we see on a lot of the things. So when we wrote the article, we wanted it to look at that. But locomotion, whether you look at just death loss of animals or combined locomotion is like injuries and things like that. If we look at that, in most of the data sets I look, it's one of the highest reasons for calls and deaths. And so I think sometimes we point in the wrong direction, just like with prolapses. I think it's something we need to work on, and it's a visual. We see it, but there are other things that are not. The sow that walks up to the farrowing house, it's got a bad foot. We try to farrow her out. We know she's not going to do well, and we may end up having to euthanize her afterward. We should have fixed her foot before we got her up there. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes we got to reposition where we're going with some of this information.
And those 6 categories, like you mentioned, were locomotion, disease, intestinal, reproductive, performance, and then kind of an other bucket.
Yeah.
How would you rank those? You mentioned locomotion was towards the top, but how do the rest of those rank?
Well, again, we've seen the intestinal one. We've seen that. And reproduction have actually gone down as far as what that particular data I shared with you that Dr. Dean had put together. We still see that category in there of other still being 30 to 40% of the thing. And we've tried to get that as so we got to do a better job of classifying some of those others into one of those 6 categories to make it easier to work with. But again, as we showed in the example, the locomotion one at this particular subset of over 10 years had tripled one of the quarters what it was like in 2005 and 2016. It had tripled the number of animals under locomotion. So definitely an area that we got to look at. And
so this is something we like to do commonly with an episode, and we're not done yet because I still want to talk and touch on piglets. You're not out of the off the hook yet, but we always like to share take-home messages with producers or folks listening. So when you kind of put a bow on this, a conclusion here for sow mortality, how would you summarize that, or what are some specific things for those working in the swine industry to think about, take home, and maybe implement in their own operations?
I think it all starts with the gilt selection process and the gilt development process. We've got to get our gilts on the farm within 60, 70 pounds of weight. So we develop them, we grow them as replacement gilts, not finisher gilts. And we've got to take ownership of that to develop them. And during that process, we need to be culling out the unsound animals, the animals that have, the toe issues, things like that. And develop those animals so when we have a gilt that comes up to the breeding area at hopefully 300 plus pounds, she's had at least 1 skip heat. It'd be nice to see him crate exposed for a few days to help total born. But she's ready to go. We've eliminated those animals that are substandard. But again, we in a lot of farms, we don't have that facility built on the older farm, so we're doing it somewhere else. Or we're bringing in mature animals, we isolate them 30 days, we bring them into the farm. All those things are not part of that development process of the gilt. So we got to be firm about her gilt development. Then we've got to incorporate in there, basically, if we do good selection, then we have to incorporate in there looking at our nutrition that fits the developing gilt, that fits the sow, and something that can address the quality of the toe and the dew claw. So that needs to be looked at again. And then the other one is the toe maintenance or the pedicures. We've got to make sure that when an animal comes out of the farrowing house or goes in, depending on which way you want to look at it. Some farms do it when they come out. They'll check their feet. They'll trim them. I've got some farms that are like 5,600 sows. They may do 70 or 80 animals a week that come out of the farrowing house. Now, my way, because I think it's safer when we don't have a lift station, is we do it in the farrowing crate when they go in. So when they leave there, their dew claws are trimmed, their toes are trimmed even, and we're ready to then put her back into the breeding and hopefully we'll have less problems with her. So it's going to be a step process, but it's all going to start with getting gilts on the farm earlier, developing the gilts as replacement gilts, not finisher animals, and doing routine maintenance then of those feet to really work on the areas we see the most critical for sow death loss.
So, Ron, you mentioned you're not really an economist by training.
No.
But as you look at the economic impact of sow mortality versus piglet mortality, which way do we skew as losing more value in the industry?
We've got enough pigs. We don't lack for pigs in the farrowing house to try and save. But every time we lose a sow, the cost, whether you want to put $1,000 or $1,500, goes up. The replacement rate goes up. Even farm the labor thing. We got labor now removing dead sows that should be in the farrowing house saving us some pigs. So we've having to divert some of our labor to projects that are not productive to us to improve the bottom line. So it's a huge cost of a dead sow to the program. Yeah, piglet survival, we got to work on that. But again, most farms have enough pigs to meet their requirement. It's that they need enough quality sows that's living in there to be able to meet their weaning needs.
And even today, as you were talking about piglet mortality rates, a lot of it still seemed to be linked back to really taking care of that sow, whether it was feed or just grooming them for farrowing. But the feed one I thought really was interesting in particular. Can you talk to us a little bit about the research that you did in the
the feeding for the piglet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was actually, I read some of the European journals that come out, and that came out a few years ago. I think Pig Progress or one of those. I was intrigued. Says feeding meal diets, feeding meal several times a day to sows pre-farrow, lowered the length of time it took her to farrow, and then it correlated to lowering stillborns. And I said, that's something we could probably do. There's not a lot of farms. There's a lot of the bigger farms. We have 24/7 labor in there. So we're attending the sows that are farrowing, all night and every day. So that's really helped reduce stillborns in those farms. But not all farms have the labor to do it. Some of the size farms are not big enough that they're farrowing so many sows at night. So I said, this could be something practical that we could actually use. So as I say, I went to the farm I showed you the example of. It's a newer farm. I've known the family for years. And they actually had a tube that comes down that they feed the sows with that had graduated numbers on it. So we could fill that tube up with 6 pounds of feed. And then we decided to go at 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 in the afternoon, going 4 hours apart there, knowing if we give her a small snack of about 1.5 pounds is what we used in initial modeling, and 1.5 pounds of diet, her energy level is going to be up. So when she's farrowing, she's getting those pigs out quicker. So we started doing that. And as we showed you an example, we dropped stillborns from about 1.5 to down to about 0.6, 0.7 pigs, or cut it almost in half just by changing the feed regimen. We didn't add any night people. We still had somebody in there till about 8 o'clock at night, but we didn't have 24/7, 7-day-a-week labor, but dropped it substantially. And we know those are usually bigger pigs. They're more robust if we can keep them alive. They don't take a lot of care to be a live pig that gets weaned later on. So we tried that there. So we did it for an entire year in a 4,500 sow unit. So that's a lot of reps. And it basically showed us we can do that. And then we decided there were some sows that, farrowed after the guys leave in the evening at 8 o'clock. What could we do with them? So then we changed the timing. We went up to about 4 to 4.5 hours between the feedings. We went to 6, we went to 10:30 or so, went to 2:30. Then we went in before they left, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and we gave her another 1.5 pounds of feeding. We dropped the stillborns down to around 2% and about 0.4. We dropped them another about 0.3 by doing that. Again, those sows that were farrowing after the crew left, they had an energy boost, like an energy bar or an energy drink or one of those right before they started to finish out their farrowing. And so that they farrowed out and we had a stillborn drop that was occurring at night when nobody was there. So it allowed us to take farms that are smaller in size, introduce a feeding strategy like this, and reduce stillborns without having to add labor and extend labor through the night. So it works so cool. And again, it was just something that we gave a try to. I've had other farms try it, similar results, some not as good. Again, I think part of it is making sure it's done on a regular basis. Every 3 to 4 hours, she gets some diet. So it keeps her energy level up. Now, I mentioned that K-State did a study similar to it, but they went every 6 hours. And they basically saw no difference. They didn't, between the controls and the fed every 6 hours, they did not reduce stillborns, but it was too long a time. She needs that feed in there every 3 to 4 hours, so she keeps her energy level high, her sugar level high in her system. So when she's farrowing, she's getting the pigs out of there, reduce the farrowing time. And when we thought at the farm, we reduced the farrowing time of most sows by about 40%. So it's not getting that prolonged farrowing. She gets tired, and at the end, she has the stillborn pigs. We got the pigs out of there. So again, a little change of how you manage had a huge impact on what we were doing at the sow farm.
And it really was a simple change, probably didn't cost the producer a whole lot more because they were just spreading that feed ration out.
Yeah, a little bit of labor to go back there on the sows that's going to farrow in the next day or two is all the ones we concentrated on. And a little time doing that, it paid big dividends.
Ron, as you look at what's coming for the industry next 5 to 10 years, what do you anticipate as far as changes or things that we need to have top of mind for us?
I think probably the concerns I have are some of the things that are being driven. Like, we started work, we're adapting to sow housing now in gestation. I don't think we exactly know what that ideal number is. Is it 10 sows or 300? How are we going to feed them? I think is a huge part. I think electronic sow feeding will be a lot more in vogue as we get to pens where at least she gets to go in. We can give her a body score. We can give her so much diet every day and she doesn't have to compete for it. So I think that's going to be where we're going to be moving. And we've learned, I think we can manage sow farms that are in pens. We got sow farms well above 30 pigs that are in pen gestation today. So we know how to understand that. The one that concerns me is a couple of things. The Prop 12 basically telling us that we can't allow sows from the time they're weaned until they're bred a few days to be in a crate more than a few hours. Well, we went to crates several years ago because we had weaned sows. We put them in a pen. They start fighting when they come into heat, and we're trying to breed them. And it's a lot of injury to the sows along with the people trying to do that task. And I think they've overstepped us a little bit there. If we go to that, we're going to see an increase in sow death loss. Because of the fighting, the injuries that's going to take place. And I personally think we'll see some drop in performance, probably farrowing rate and maybe even in total born. The other area that concerns me is farrowing house. I've got farms I work with. We have turnaround farrowing crates in them, but we're allowed to lock the sow down for up to 72 hours while she's in the farrowing process. And after that's done, then we can open up the crates and let her move around. I think that's something we can live with. But if we eliminate the ability to lock the sow down for a period of time and she's in a pen, that takes away from our ability to sleeve a sow that's in distress. Because now we're putting people in the pen with a sow and we're putting them in danger. So we're trying to make it better for the sow, but they're not thinking about the danger we're putting the employees in, getting in here, trying to reach up a sow and pull out a dead pig. So I think we will see more sows dying in the labor process because of pigs that get hung up in them, and more increase in stillborns and pre-weaning mortality because we can't assist a sow during that farrowing process. And I think it's going to be a real negative to the industry. And maybe that's what some of these folks want it to happen, that they have more data to claim that we're not doing a good job. But we want to be transparent what we do. We just need to sit down and talk and say, what's practical here? I think the Europeans, they haven't done a good job of being transparent and working to they get something legislated in, they just try to readapt to it. I think we gotta work with people. But I think everything will continue to go up until we got to put things in place that allow us to work with the animal for the best of the animal and the safety of the employees. And we've got to be able to work with that.
And I think that's a big goal around this grant. And I know a lot of moving pieces are happening. A lot of folks like you and others are working to make those changes sustainable across the entire industry. But Ron, certainly appreciate your time today.
It's been my pleasure. I enjoy doing these kind of things. And as I'm kind of going into this partial retirement, I've already got a couple groups I'm going to be doing some work with. They're doing some innovative things that I'm kind of intrigued with. And I still got a few years in here to probably contribute to what the industry's doing. But it's been really great for me. I started in 1973, and I've gone through from the outside to the inside, and now we want to go back outside. It's just been interesting, all the different transitions we've gone to in the technology. But as we showed you in the table for 16 years, the efficiency of the sow's gone up. That's important. We're trying to be competitive, make meat a good value for people, and make it competitive. And I think the problem is there's people now trying to tell us what we should be doing when it's not there. They don't have the knowledge to do that for us. We want to be efficient. We want to have a high quality protein that's at a reasonable cost for people to consume. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
The gilt selection and gilt development processes both serve as two of the most important factors when decreasing sow mortality. And of course, those 6 buckets Dr. Ketchem shared are also keys to decreasing mortality, which were locomotion, disease, intestinal, reproductive performance, and other. That link between piglet survivability and sow care is essential, and although piglet mortality is important, sow mortality can be more costly and harder to rebuild. So go ahead, give those sows their pedicures. Tune in next month as we share some opportunities for measurable impact in your operation. Until then, I'm Delaney Howell, and this has been another episode of the PigX Podcast.
PigX is a national podcast hosted by the Pig Livability Project partners at Iowa State University, Kansas State University, and Purdue, and supported by the Iowa Pork Industry Center. For more information on the project, head to www.piglivability.org, or to inquire directly with questions regarding the project, email ipic@iastate.edu. PigX. Ideas in the swine industry worth sharing.